You know, I was sitting here at my table tonight thinking so many things, but one of them I'm going to ask for you to keep a secret. I'm going to share it with you all. Nobody does pro-life quite as well as Ohio. And I'll be really honest, I have spent a fair amount of time in Ohio over the years, from fundraising to testifying for legislation, you name it. I never knew how incredible Toledo is. And I have friends here tonight in ministry who are probably going, Melissa, how did you not know? You've known us for years. Okay, I'll be honest, I did not know. But now I know. And I am so incredibly grateful. What you have here in Toledo, in Ohio, is so special. You are paving the way for the rest of our nation. You have for a long time. And as we set our sights on a world that is dramatically different when Roe is finally kicked to the curb, like it should be, you have paved a way for the rest of our country to know what it's like to be truly pro-life from womb to tomb. And so can you give yourselves a round of applause? I am incredibly grateful for all of you. When I come to events like this, I know that people are looking forward to hearing my story, but I need to be really, really honest with you all. When I come into a room like this, I often feel like I am standing shoulder to shoulder with the giants of the pro-life movement. Many of you have been doing this for decades. For so many of you, this is the legacy of your family, second generation, third generation. For so many of you, you have given so sacrificially of your time and your talent and your treasure. And I know that most of you, if you're like me, feel like you're just an ordinary person. And I wake up every day and I feel that way about myself. Whether the world wants to call me a failure or a hero, somewhere in between, I can tell you that I always feel like I'm an ordinary person who was simply called by God to do an extraordinary thing. And I truly believe that that's all of our life stories. Ordinary people, by the grace of God, are called to do extraordinary things. And by the grace of God, those extraordinary things add up to doing something extraordinary, making an extraordinary difference in our world. And so tonight, as I share so much of my story with you and really educate you a little bit about what I know about failed abortions and abortion survivors, I hope that you can be inspired and encouraged by the ordinary people in my life who, by the grace of God, have done extraordinary things. People who simply saw my humanity, worked to save my life, prayed for me, loved me, came alongside me. The list could go on and on with ordinary people who, by the grace of God, have done extraordinary things. And without them, I wouldn't be here tonight. What an incredible blessing I have been given by extraordinary people. And what I love as I've gotten to know Foundation for Life and Ed and all of the team is that you are making extraordinary differences right here in your community. And when we think about this battle for life, I know we all have our own little corner that we're working in, and together, all of those corners come together to create this beautiful tapestry of the pro-life community. But when I think about how we serve and we make a difference in the pro-life movement, education is such an important piece of it. We talk so much about the pillars in the pro-life movement. And I think of three in particular. I think of truth, which is education, day in and day out. So truth, legislation, and love. Those are my pillars of the pro-life movement. And when I think about Foundation for Life and all of the work that they're doing, they are grounded around those three pillars. As they're providing education and outreach, it's about truth. It leads to bold, innovative legislation like what Jeff was talking about. And it also is always rooted in love. And my life story, believe it or not, actually also started in love. I know you would never expect that when you hear that I'm someone who survived an abortion procedure. But I now know that I was very much loved. If you don't know this about me, I'm clearly not from Ohio, if I didn't know that Toledo was so incredible. I'm from Iowa originally. Anybody ever been? Yeah, I know. People laugh, don't they? Oh, yeah, thank you. Somebody clapped well for Iowa. I appreciate that. Most people don't know where Iowa is, to be perfectly honest, unless they're from the Midwest. Even the other day, someone got Iowa and Ohio mixed up. Happens regularly. I am from Iowa originally. I now live in Kansas City. Don't hold it against me when we talk about sports. That's a thing. But my life story started 44 years ago. We'll get that little minor detail out of the way. I am 44. It's okay. It's important for historical context, right? Because we know that we are getting dangerously close to 49 years of Roe versus Wade. And so that's an important piece because we now know, of course, that it wasn't long after Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton were passed that my life was meant to be ended by a saline infusion abortion. And what I know about my birth mother, who I now know very much did love me, what I know about my birth mother is that she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. My birth mother looked an awful lot like the women who come through the doors of Capitol Care still today. My birth mother was 19 years old. She was a college student. She wasn't yet married to my biological father, but she was engaged to him. And sadly, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that most of our society doesn't want to talk about, but all of us in this room know so very much about, and that's coercion. It's such a fascinating thing after almost 5 decades of legal abortion to still hear it championed as a choice and a right. And of course, now we see it called even more things like health care. The very act that was meant to end my life was somehow health care. We know what a faulty argument that really is. But when we look at statistics in our society, in this world that wants to call it choice and a right, we know statistically that over 64% of women identify feeling pressured into their abortion. And that's just those that identify that pressure. We know that very few women in our world actually have any real choice when it comes to abortion. And as you're going to hear tonight, as I started to really discover my own life story over the years, I moved throughout this kind of journey of first being told it was my birth mother's choice to have that abortion. And then as I started to learn more about abortion and I investigated her family a little bit, I realized that she was one of those statistics, the women that are coerced into an abortion. And sadly, what I learned in recent years is that it was taken even one step further for her. That saline infusion abortion that was meant to end my life and forever changed hers isn't just something she was coerced into. It was literally forced upon her against her will. We had family members who offered to let her reside with them when they found out that she was pregnant with me. My biological father would have married her if he had been given the opportunity to. But every single choice was taken away from her, except the door that led to St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. We live in a world that talks about choice and right, but doesn't listen to every voice when it comes to abortion. Our stories are swept under the rug underneath the heavy, heavy abortion narrative. And so I know my birth mother's story is not unique. I think what's most unique is that I have lived to tell our story. That saline infusion abortion that was forced upon my birth mother, I know many of you remember it from back in the 1970s. It was that common abortion procedure performed back then. You know, that abortion procedure, fortunately for me, but unfortunately for the abortion industry, was not as effective as they wanted it to be. And as you study abortion history and survivors in particular, if you aren't familiar, I highly recommend reading the Dreaded Complication series that came out in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1981. In it, they tell story after countless story like mine of children who survived failed abortions, and saline abortions in particular. They tell the stories of piles of babies blackened by that saline, piled up in the hospital. It was a horrific abortion procedure. But whether a child survived it or not, they learned very quickly that it was not as effective as they wanted it to be. They believed it would be successful in my life, though. It was forced upon my birth mother there at St. Luke's Hospital, believing that she was less than 5 months pregnant with me. And trust me, I hear this so frequently in the population of survivors that I work to heal and empower and equip. Like so many other abortionists, and like this abortion clinic here, who doesn't really want to know the truth or follow regulations, I know an awful lot of survivors who are born alive because their abortionist didn't perform any kind of proper examination. So they don't know how far along a woman really is in her pregnancy. But they thought my birth mother was less than 5 months pregnant with me when that abortion was forced upon her. That abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. Usually the procedure lasted about 72 hours. If the child was fortunate enough, their life was ended within about the first 24. And then they would induce labor over the next 48 hours with the intent of that deceased child being expelled from the womb. I have met so many women who underwent that same abortion procedure, and there could very well be someone here tonight who did. And if you are one of them, I want to tell you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what you experienced, because I have met so many women who have told me how they felt their child thrashing about in the womb, fighting for their life before things quieted. And they knew that it was done. As horrific as that procedure is, we know through my medical records just how horrendous it really was for me and for my biological mother. Because we know through those medical records, I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for just 24 hours or 3 days. I soaked in it for 5 days, longer than even the standards of that procedure. Why? Well, I joked last night, I'm a little stubborn. It's true. If you don't know me very well, I guess you could say I have a very perseverant attitude. And I truly believe the Lord blessed me with that personality and that tenacity. But of course, all kidding aside, the longer I soaked in that toxic salt solution, the greater the likelihood should have been that my life was ended by it. And so on that 5th day, when they finally successfully induced my birth mother's labor after trying time and time again, on that 5th day, they believed that I would be delivered as a quote unquote successful abortion, of course known as a deceased child. And as you heard in my introduction tonight, we know what the world and the abortion industry has to say about people like me. I am somehow a failure. But you know what they also call people like me? The dreaded complication of abortion. A child who lives. Somehow my life is something that should be dreaded, something to be avoided, something that should have been prevented. Is it any wonder why we need born alive legislation in our world when the abortion industry tags survivors as a dreaded complication? Is there any reason why they would immediately see our humanity and immediately provide us medical care? I think we all know the answer to that. But here I was, 44 years ago, born alive in the final step of that abortion procedure. You have a birthday, right? I have a day that I celebrate that I was accidentally born alive on. the gravity of that day is never lost on me. Yes, it is my birthday, but it was never meant to be, at least by the hands of people in this world. I wish I could stand here tonight and tell you that when I was accidentally born alive that day, all of the medical professionals called me a miracle. But this is not how stories like mine are often lived out. I was told years ago that when I was accidentally born alive that day, my abortionist demanded that I be left in that hospital room to die. Sadly, we know that I am not the first nor the last child in our world that has happened to. And sadly for me, I now know that the truth is much more painful. It wasn't the abortionist who demanded that I be left to die. It was someone much closer to me. It was my grandmother. That's who forced that abortion upon my birth mother. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community, was an associate dean of a nursing college, oversaw the supervision of many young nurses, had a very close working relationship with the abortionist. From what I've been told, he owed her a really big favor. That big favor led to that door at St. Luke's Hospital that my birth mother was forced into against her will. And I know that's hard for people to hear, but we know through the testimony of abortionists, former abortionists like Dr. Bernard Nathanson and others, that it is not that rare of a practice for abortions to be performed on people who are very close to them. And I know that this is what abortion has done to our society. People now make life and death decisions about people like me every single day, regardless of their relationship to them. And I don't blame my grandmother. I blame abortion. And I don't know what it was in her life that victimized her, that led her to that day in that hospital. But I can tell you that she was a much greater victim in all of this than I will ever be, because I love her. No matter what I've learned about her, I love her unconditionally. Almost radically, I guess some people would say. I know, it doesn't make sense to people sometimes. But I can tell you that my grandmother was a broken human being, just like you and me. And trust me, I'm broken. I'm always in the process of being healed, but I am broken, just like her and just like you. And I realize that Christ died on the cross for her as much as he did for me and for you. And my abortionist, that list could go on and on. And so I truly believe that she was much more victimized because I've been allowed to love her and forgive her and have my life transformed by that. She did not walk out that path in her life. Please pray for the repose of her soul still today. You know, I am grateful to tell you, though, that no matter what demands my grandmother was making about my life that day at the hospital, there were other nurses on staff that day who defied her very orders. My mom and dad had heard about a couple of nurses over the years who had intervened to save my life. And I was so blessed when my first book came out a few years ago to hear from one of the nurses who knew directly about how my life was spared. She sent me an email after she had read my book. She said, "You know, Melissa, I've been following you for years on social media. Always wondered if you were the baby that I remembered from St. Luke's Hospital. After reading your book, I know without a doubt it is you." She wasn't the nurse who was there when I was delivered alive, but she was working in the neonatal intensive care unit when a tall blonde nurse rushed me there, believing that if other people found out that the abortion had failed and this little girl had lived, that maybe, just maybe, they could provide medical care that would sustain my life. Clearly, it did. I now know that when that nurse rushed me off to the NICU, my grandmother was hot on her heels for very good reason. And you won't hear about that reason until much later in my life story. But she arrived there in the NICU. And you would never know by looking at me that when I was rushed off to the NICU by that tall blonde nurse, I was hanging on for dear life. When I survived that failed abortion, I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I was a whopping 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which indicated to the medical professionals, and if any of you are in sonography in here, you'll probably have a good guess. It really led them to believe that my birth mother was much further along in her pregnancy than that 18 to 20 weeks written on my medical records. And a neonatologist remarked in a little corner that he estimated I was probably about 31 weeks. 31 weeks. So based on Ohio law, I still wouldn't be protected today, would I? Based on what that abortionist had written on my medical records. I want you to think about that for a second, because we're celebrating what has happened in my life, and we're celebrating the work that is done through Foundation for Life. But I think we all have to realize what the answer really is, and it's truth and legislation and love for us to make abortion unthinkable. So there I was, about 31 weeks gestational age, when I was rushed off to the NICU. I presented with severe fetal distress to the point that the doctors thought I had a fatal heart defect. I suffered from severe respiratory and liver problems, seizures for an extended period of time. The doctors didn't believe I would live past my infancy. And if I did, they suspected I would have multiple disabilities. And we live in a world that somehow wants to put a disclaimer on my life and say that maybe that is a life that wasn't worth living. I have people who have still approached me today and said, Melissa, who on earth ever would have loved you in that state? Who? My parents, my mom and dad. Other people know them as my adoptive parents, but trust me, they are just my mom and dad. You'll catch my parents sometimes in interviews talk about how the first time they met me, I was still lying in an incubator full of tubes and wires, fighting for my life. And my mom will tell you the moment she laid eyes on me, they fell in love with me. And I want that for every child in our world, don't you? Every child deserves that opportunity to have someone fall in love with them. They just have to be given that opportunity. The parents need to be given that opportunity to fall in love with their child, with education and ultrasound and all of those things. These children, just like me, deserve to be loved. And my parents are ordinary people. If they were here tonight, they would tell you that. They feel like they are the most ordinary people in the world. But I can tell you, to me, they are still extraordinary. My parents loved me into life. I went home just a few months after surviving that failed abortion. I was healed and healthy enough to go home with them. And I was raised in a home of deep faith, as you can probably imagine already. You know, I can't even tell you when I first knew Jesus, because that was just part of our lives. And my parents did a beautiful job of raising my older sister and I. My sister is also adopted. They raised us to know that adoption meant that we were loved, and not just by them and not just by God, but we were loved by our biological parents. That's what my parents wanted me to know about my life. And I don't believe that there is any point in time where they ever would have looked upon it and went, you know, now I think is a good time to tell Melissa about that failed abortion. I now work with families around the world in how and when and what to tell their survivor about their story. You know, I was blessed to sit down a little bit earlier and tell Ed about one particular survivor you have here in Ohio. She would have been here tonight with me, but schedules changed. She is public now with her story, so I'll share her name with you. Her name is Mika. Mika is in her early 40s. Mika has a lot of health issues that she's not afraid to talk about because of the amount of stress that she has encountered in her life, from surviving an abortion procedure to then living in foster care and experiencing trauma many times in her life. Mika now knows her story, but she didn't for a very long time. She now knows that she was abandoned at an abortion clinic by her biological mother after the abortion failed. Her mom not only abandoned her, but her toddler brother. We now know that there is much more to Mika's story and her mother's story that you're going to hear about, I think, sometime really soon, because I want to connect her with everything that you're doing. But Mika is just one of many survivors that we work with around the world who learn their stories at different times. Right now, the youngest survivors we have connected to our network are under 1 year of age. I actually testified before Congress against the Women's Health Protection Act earlier this year, and I actually was able to share in my congressional testimony about a baby who was born at about 25 weeks in the middle of the pandemic after a failed abortion. That baby is still alive today. And that is some of the most redemptive work I get to do in this world, is come alongside parents just like mine so that they can grapple with and really be prepared to tell an abortion survivor their story. Because this is how we end the generational impact of abortion. We heal, we empower, and we equip people. My parents, though, had no one to turn to years ago, and so they blindly fumbled along the way. They never intended for me to find out my story, and certainly not the way that I did. But I think God intended for me to know. And he allowed it to come forward in a very unplanned kind of way when I was 14. So it was 30 years ago, almost to this very day, that I learned the story of my survival. Because my older sister, as a high school student, faced her own unplanned pregnancy. And even though we were raised in a home with firm beliefs about the sanctity of life and the gift of adoption, like so many women in that position, she had fears and anxieties. The culture out there was telling her she could never be successful. She was contemplating every choice back then. And when our parents found that out, they decided they were called to do something very bold, to save her life and the life of their unborn grandchild. They told her my story, broke their silence, having carried that secret for 14 years throughout my life. They told her my story, hoping she would understand just how much abortion impacts each and every one of our lives. That was nearly 30 years ago. I can tell you my oldest nephew is almost 30. I'm so grateful for her. My sister, of course, carried him, parented him, graduated from high school on time, was supported by our family and so many people in our community. And she went on and had other children. You know, I am so grateful that my sister was a shining example to so many of us about how an unplanned pregnancy can still be carried out with joy and with love and support. And my nephew knows that he could have been just another statistic when it comes to abortion. But more importantly, he knows he was made for just such a time as that. Because after my sister found out the story of my survival and ultimately chose life, like any good teenage sister, she didn't keep it a secret from me. I know this isn't the way this was supposed to happen. As you heard, now I do something very different with families because I learned the hard way 30 years ago what happens when a couple of teenage girls have an argument. I know. I have 2 daughters now myself, and so I know a little bit about what my future is going to hold with them. You know, I didn't have any idea that I could have survived a failed abortion. And during an argument one night, after my sister had already made that decision to carry him, she said something to me that had never been said at our house before. She said, "You know, Melissa, at least my biological parents wanted me." I was thinking, whoa, hold up. Wait a minute, this is different. We were raised on equal footing here in our home. We're equally placed for adoption. We were equally loved by our biological parents who made this loving plan for us. And I turned around to say something to her that night, and the look on her face just stopped me dead in my tracks. And that's when I knew there was something else going on. Ended up getting through that moment, sitting my mother down when she got home from work later that night and asking her to explain to me why my sister could ever feel more wanted than I was. I can tell you my mom wanted to avoid that conversation. We spent hours dancing around that whole piece until ultimately she had to break her silence the final time. And the words just fell out of her mouth. She said, "Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it." And there are no words. 30 years later, the other day I was doing a podcast, and it doesn't matter how many thousands of times I've shared my story. I was sitting down with a podcaster choking up. as I shared that story of being 14 years old and sitting on a couch and having my mother tell me the story of my survival. And I can tell you, whether you're 14 or you're in your 70s, which that happens to some of my survivors, they don't find out their story until decades later, sometimes after they've had an abortion or two themselves. I can tell you, no matter what age you find out that you survived an abortion, it changes your life forever. I clearly knew God had a purpose and a plan for me. I could feel it stirring in my soul that night. But it's really hard to embrace your purpose when you're in the midst of pain. I was in pain that night. I was angry for the first time with my biological parents. I couldn't understand how they made that decision about my life. Couldn't understand why they couldn't just place me for adoption, like my sister was placed. I grappled with all the human emotions you can imagine: the anger, the resentment, the grief, the shame and embarrassment for being an abortion survivor when the world tells us that we are nothing but a failure. Maybe a choice, someone else is right to make a decision about if we're lucky. All those words weighed so heavily on me, as they do on so many abortion survivors. Think about that. When we open the news, when we turn on the TV and we see abortion talked about, think about the weight of the abortion narrative as it weighs on people, and abortion survivors in particular. That weight weighed me down, and I struggled on this journey. I made so many mistakes in my pain, poor coping skills, you name it, I probably tried it. Trying to distance myself from my suffering and the truth about who God made me to be. And what I love is that God stood steadfast by my side, reminded me day in and day out that he never makes any mistakes. And I am so grateful that one of the most important things he allowed me to do is forgive my biological parents. I didn't know back then that the abortion was forced or my grandmother played this huge role in it taking place. But what I knew in my heart is that my birth parents had to have been forever changed by that abortion. And I knew in my heart that I loved them, seeing them as fellow broken human beings, seeing their humanity that is like yours and like mine. And so I forgave them for the first time when I was a teenager. And I say first time because this is not something that I'm ever finished with. I choose to forgive deliberately day in and day out. And things happen in life where we have to keep doing the hard work, don't we? As the mother of two little girls, can you imagine when I gave birth to my own children and stared at their vulnerable little faces? Knew they never would have lived if that abortion would have succeeded in ending my life. I had to choose to forgive in the face of that. And as I shared last night, this is not by human comprehension, I think, that any of us forgive. It is by the grace of God. And that's what I do day in and day out, especially when the days get hard. And I face the abortion industry as I'm testifying, and they can't even look me in the eye. I had somebody years ago here in Ohio, when I first testified for the heartbeat bill, I had one of the pro-abortion legislators actually get up and leave that committee meeting. They can't even see my humanity because of how it's an inconvenient truth to their narrative. So I choose to forgive in the face of that, and I pray for the grace to forgive in those moments. And if you're stumbling along that journey, I hope that you can find some encouragement too tonight to pray for the grace to forgive, because that changed my life. It allowed me to start on this journey of healing. I now heal abortion survivors from 18 different countries. Why? Because I spent a long time doing it myself, and I learned a lot along the way. But healing and forgiving is what set me out to be here tonight. And that's really what set me out on a course to find my biological parents. Before I came forward with God's story in this world, I wanted them to hear from me because I didn't want to traumatize them. And so I went looking for them. It took me 10 years to find them. It took me over 10 years to obtain my medical records. You know, I love that in the work that I do with abortion survivors, I now know that most people like me will never have any medical record. The other side likes to use that as a complaint, that somehow we must be liars. Oh, you must have just wanted to be famous. You know, if I ever wanted to be famous for something, this was not on the list. And people who know me really well know that I am one of the most private I'm just one of the most private people you will ever meet in your life, except for when God opened my life to the world because there were lessons to be learned by it. But most abortion survivors will not have any medical record. And we could all name off a real long list tonight of why we don't have any medical records. And so I now know that most do not. Most survivors that we're connected with, the 403 we've reached out to, are actually raised in their biological family because the child was never the problem. The circumstances they were facing were the problem. So most survivors learn their story because it's passed along through family lines. You know, I didn't know that years ago. I simply knew that God was calling me forward with this story. And if I was going to fight this battle, I needed to be equipped to do it. And so I went looking for my medical records. And as I shared, it took me over 10 years to obtain them. After being told time and time again over those 10 years, no, there's nothing. Multiple hospitals that I was at, nothing exists. Maybe some of you have lived out similar years in your life. You're searching, desperately searching for God's will. You're matching it up with the plans you have laid out for your life. You're praying that prayer of surrender to say, Lord, here I am, send me. I don't know what this looks like, but send me anyway. Those were my 10 years of searching. You know, during those 10 years of searching, I led a pretty normal life. I married my husband, who I could not do this without. We've been married for nearly 16 years. This is as much his ministry and my family's as it is mine. During those 10 years of searching, I moved to Sioux City, Iowa. Sound familiar to anybody? I didn't grow up there, but I moved there during my 10 years of searching to obtain my master's degree in social work. You know, I never thought for a second that this was all part of God's greater plan of restoration and reconciliation. But you're going to hear as I close tonight, this was all his plan. You know, during those 10 years of searching, I really did surrender myself to his will. And suddenly in 2007, after I had laid it all at his feet, I obtained my medical records. And you can see them in my book. We tweet them out sometimes for fun. I've showed them to Congress more times than I can count. They don't have a lot to say, believe it or not, when faced with the facts about abortion and faced with the life of an abortion survivor. Because in those medical records, they say things that are really powerful. Things like a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. In another piece of my medical records, it identifies a complication of pregnancy as a saline infusion. Isn't that radical? You can say that it complicated things, and not just for me, but for my biological mother. And so through those medical records, I ultimately learned a lot about what I survived and how people intervened to save my life. What I never could have imagined is that they would hold a very important piece of information: my birth parents' names. After 10 years of searching for them, that's how I found them. And I started searching diligently that night, and you're never going to guess what I discovered. I was living in the very same city as my biological father. He had been from that area, still lived there 30 years later. I ended up sending him a letter around that time in 2007, letting him know essentially all the things I've told you all tonight, and that we lived in the same city if he ever wanted to communicate or establish a relationship. Sadly, I never heard from my biological father. Months passed, and during that time, I actually set my sights on my birth mother and her family. I couldn't find my birth mother through my searching, but I found her parents very easily. You know, that grandmother that I shared so much with you about. I didn't know back then that she played the huge role in the abortion taking place that she did. And I sent my grandparents a letter asking for them to reach out to my birth mother on my behalf. Do you guys ever do things in your life, look back on it, and go, wow, I really can't believe I did that? If my husband was here tonight, he would tell you, yes, that is an everyday occurrence at our house. One minute I'm scrubbing a toilet, the next minute I get the call that says I need to go meet the president in the Oval Office. It is wild. You do these things. Sometimes you get the phone call that says, yes, you're going to go testify before Congress. And I lovingly call those the Holy Spirit inspired moments. You say yes, jump in, feet first, and then later maybe you ask a question. And I look back on sending my grandparents' letter now knowing everything that I do, and part of me thinks, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. But I am so grateful that I did, because I am rather sure my grandparents needed to hear from me as much as my birth mother did. My grandfather replied to my letter within days, which is something that was incredibly unexpected on my behalf. In his letter, he shared some truths about my birth mother and their family, and I want to share a couple of those points with you. You know, the first point he shared was that I knew that my live birth was not the intention that day. That was some fancy wordsmithing around the word abortion, but I know what he meant. But it was courageous of him, and it was equally courageous for him to share some things about their family. One of the points he shared was that my birth mother had never told anyone about her abortion, and I know she's not alone in that. No matter what happens in our world legislatively, we are called to love people, and we are called to heal. And I truly believe that is the greatest obstacle we are facing right now. That is the most extraordinary thing we as ordinary people can do in our world today, is help people find healing and hope after an abortion has occurred. And I am blessed to know the ladies at the Haven here in Toledo, who I know are doing an incredible job at making that happen right here in your community. But my grandfather closed his letter with a final point. And that was that my messages would not be passed along to my birth mother. Why? Because in reality, they were completely estranged. It makes sense, doesn't it? When we now know what really happened 44 years ago, it makes such great sense that their relationship was severed. And I see this around the world, and maybe you do too. Abortion doesn't just end a life most of the time. It impacts people's relationships. It changes families for generations, unless that healing occurs. And as I close my time with you tonight, though, I want to share about some healing that has occurred, not only in my life, but the lives of my biological family. If you want to cue up that first photo. When I first shared my story publicly, what I never could have imagined is that I was just a few days pregnant with our oldest daughter, Olivia, who is now 13. 13, believe it or not. She has been carrying fetal models since she was a little tiny baby. Her favorite gift when she was 4 years old is she got a full set of fetal models, the expensive ones. Y'all know what I'm talking about. But I was a few days pregnant with her, and what I never could have imagined is that as I was proceeding in my pregnancy with her and getting involved in the pro-life movement, I would learn that my biological father had a good reason for not replying to my letter. He passed away. He passed away. But not long after he passed away, that important man you see on the screen came into my life. That is my grandfather, my biological father's father. When he passed away, they cleaned out his office and found my letter tucked in his top desk drawer. I think there's a lesson there for all of us, you guys. Don't leave off for tomorrow what you need to do today. How many days did he probably hold on to that letter and think maybe tomorrow was going to be the day he would bring himself to connect with me? But my grandfather and my great aunt were a huge part of my family's lives. My great aunt is still a part of my life still today. My grandfather, though, unfortunately passed away in the pandemic at the age of 91. And even though my family is still reeling from this news about this failed abortion and the secrets that even my biological father carried to his grave, I still take hope in the midst of it. And I hope that you do too. I know God's not done yet. He's not done working in their lives, and he's not done working in yours, and he's not done working in mine. But as I close tonight, I want to share with you something very extraordinary. If you want to cue up that last photo. Even though I haven't heard from my grandparents for a very long time, one of her family members reached out to me in 2013. That's how I learned that my grandmother was responsible for so many things. That's how I learned the abortion was forced. And that's how I learned the greatest secret that even my adoptive parents didn't know about my survival. And that's that my birth mother spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. She was told it was successful. She was told, it's hideous, it's a monster, don't look at it. She didn't know if it was a little boy or a little girl. But what she knew is that she lived with the rest of her life with incredible regret until she saw her child in interviews sharing their story. The one trauma I tried to prevent was the one trauma that I couldn't. And we started to communicate back in 2013, and her biggest question was, how could you ever love me? How could you ever forgive any of us considering what we have done to you? And so we spent about 3 years building walls of trust and love with one another before we finally met face to face for the first time. In this photo, you will see these extraordinary women who are ordinary, just like you and me. On the left is my half-sister, Sarah, who's a professor in Maine. Next to her in the red sweater is my birth mother, whose name happens to be Ruth. I am standing next to her, and alongside me is my half-sister, Jennifer. We are a picture of God's restoration, redemption, reconciliation. And as if that wasn't enough, God did something so extraordinary in our lives. I moved from Sioux City, Iowa, where my birth father lived, ultimately to Kansas City in 2013. And where do you think my birth mother lives? Kansas City, alongside my half-sister, Jennifer. I was just sitting at this table last night getting a text from Ruth. My children know her as just another one of their grandmothers. My children are raised alongside my half-sister's children as their cousins. We try to live the most ordinary of lives, but we know in the midst of it, God has done something extraordinary. And if Ruth was here tonight, I know that she would thank you on behalf of our entire family for doing the work that you are doing through Foundations for Life and throughout your pro-life community. We are ordinary people who, by the grace of God, have had people make an extraordinary difference in our lives. And as we continue on in this work, and we have so much hope about what is happening in the world, I want to encourage you tonight to stay the course. Now is our time to keep doing extraordinary things. So thank you so much for your support of Foundation for Life. Thank you, Ed and team, for all you do. Dr. Popovich, I want to bring you on up here tonight so you can talk to people about how they can continue to make an extraordinary difference through Foundations for Life. God bless you.